This is the first session in our Middle Eastern Islamic history group. Today's session is kind of unique because usually we're going to be talking about history. This session we're going to be talking about religion because the religion plays a role in history. So I just want to lay out a few rules, a few sort of guideposts about how these sessions are going to go. And the first one is that this is not an academic presentation. My name is Richard Sassoon. I'm a complete amateur, and everybody in the group is amateurs. I don't have a degree in history, in philosophy, in religion, in any of the fields that we're going to be discussing. But these are things that I find very interesting, and I hope that you can enjoy what I have to say. I also want to point out that this is a secular presentation because today we're covering a religion. I am not Muslim. I've never been Muslim. And I'm going to try and give this presentation from sort of a bird's eye secular point of view. There are naturally going to be disagreements between secular perception of religion and religious perception of religion. And so because of that, I want to invoke Will Wheaton's law, which is, of course, the phrase, don't be a dick. If I have to define that, you're probably on the wrong side of it. But, you know, just be respectful of other people, because one of the things that I really prize about this sort of forum is its interactivity, right? So there's going to be questions, comments, clarifications. People should feel free to ask me whatever they want to ask me, interject in the middle of the conversation, because I know this information, but this is about us learning together. So if there's something that I say that you want to ask about, please do. If you don't feel comfortable asking out loud because this is being recorded, please feel free to put your questions in the chat with the beginning phrase Q : and then write your question, and Zach will read off the question at the next available opportunity. And I have designed this sort of seminar to be sort of a 101 and a 201, and all of the lessons will have that sort of feature. And what I mean by that is that if you don't know anything, don't worry, I'll catch you up on the basics. And if you know something, there's going to be lots of other pieces of wisdom and information that you can otherwise apply. So it's got both of those levels going on at the same time. If you don't catch everything, that's fine. That's one of the benefits of the fact that it's recorded. You can watch it later. You can go over the details. And especially because a lot of these tenets develop over the course of history, we're often going to see these things recurring. And so one of the fun parts about it being recorded is you can always go back and see something that you didn't quite grasp the first time. When it's now in context, you understand it better. There's also a really great possibility if you miss a Tuesday, for whatever reason, it's going to be recorded. You can watch it and feel like you're caught up and you won't have missed anything. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to keep these sessions at exactly 2 hours. So at 9 o'clock, that will be the last piece of material I'll cover for the day. If there's still slides, that'll just go into next week. I'll finish up whatever discussion there is, and then we'll go home. So you don't have to worry about staying over and long hauls. And finally, this is a rule about this particular session, right? When I say Islam says, or Muslims say, or Islam argues, or Muslims have done, or whatever phrasing in that vein that I use, I'm using that phrasing in the sense of most or many or a large percentage. I'm not using that phrase in the term of all, because every Muslim's experience of Islam is different. And Islam, like any ideological construct, all religions are ideological construct, but Islam, like any ideological construct, is perceived by people in many different ways. So don't take this as a defining aspect of what somebody who is Muslim believes. In fact, most Muslims believe a variety of different things, Islam being one among many. Any questions about the rules before we head forward? All right, on to the fun stuff. All right, so one of the most common sort of arguments that people discuss is, what does the word Islam mean? Now, in Arabic, which is the primary language of Islam, and we're going to sort of get into that as we move forward in the presentation today. Arabic has 3-letter roots. So you can see in this case, the 3 letters are S, L, and M. So many Muslims will say Islam means peace, right? Because the word peace also has those root letters, Islam, salam, right? You can see that there, and I've highlighted in the Arabic how those 3 letters fit together. Now, those who advocated usually against Islam will use the point that the verb to surrender is istislam, that also has that S, L, and M together. So advocates will say Islam means peace, and those who argue against it will say that Islam means surrender. And and peace and surrender mean those meanings as you would understand them, right? If I said istaslama al-jaysh, right, the army surrendered, right? That's the meaning. Hunaka salam, there is peace, right? So like those words have those meanings. But in truth, Islam doesn't mean either of those things. And it's sort of, we have to understand a little bit of Islamic theology to understand what the concept actually is. So in the Islamic worldview, everything in the natural environment behaves according to a divine order. If you're familiar with Chinese philosophy, the idea of the Tao would be very applicable here, that there's a way in which the world exists. And animals and plants and rocks and rivers and streams and the sky and all of these elements of our natural world follow this order. They are, in a sense, deterministic, right? That the animal can only do what its instinct tells it to do. The plant can only grow because of the genes that are implanted in it. But human beings, according to Islam, have a libertarian free will, right? They have the ability to decide and make choices. And that ability to decide and make choices puts them at natural odds with this system that is deterministic. So humans exist in this way that is different to the natural order. And so what Islam says is that God has prescribed a way for mankind to willingly choose to become part of this natural order, to become part of the natural environment, to follow the way that all other things are. And if you surrender yourself to that way, if you accept those commands and undertake those commands, you will in turn find peace, because the discordant nature that humans feel, the angst and anxiety of existence, right? Similar to Buddhism, this is the concept of dukkha in Buddhism, right? The anxiety of existence, the unsatisfactoriness of existence, is because humans are acting in direct opposition to the natural way that they should be if they were part of this deterministic way that the rest of the universe is. So you will achieve peace through this act of surrendering your will to the divine mandates. So this is the idea of what Islam is. Islam is this act of surrender to God's will, and through that act of surrender, finding peace.
Richard?
Yeah.
Is any of this akin to the Asian Qi, which is like life force, the Qi?
I would say that it's not equivalent in the sense that Qi imparts spirit to those things, right? Islam would argue that only humans have souls, right? Animals and plants do not have souls. It's much closer, as I pointed out, to the concept of Tao, that there is, right? In Taoism, the idea is that there is a way that the world is. And humans, through the creation of civilization, through the creation of social developments, and the rest of these things, have differentiated ourselves from that way, right? That's the idea of Taoism. And so the point of a Taoist is to find himself back to the way. And Islam would say very similarly, except that it wouldn't say that the way is to return to nature, right? Islam would not argue that. Islam is a religion that believes in cities and civilization and mankind. The thing is, though, that man has urges and desires that are in conflict with this natural world, that are in conflict with the desires that he should be having, right, if he follows God's will. So it's the surrender to that will that is Islam. So it's a little different than Qi.
So Richard, so in your opinion, Islam is not surrender. It's more close to we call Tao than surrender, right? Call Tao to surrender to God.
Yes, I would say that that's probably a better way to phrase it. As I just want to point out, as I said before, that Taoism has a much greater affinity to behaving the way nature behaves as a way of connecting to the Tao. Islam does not believe in behaving the way nature behaves to connect to the way, because God designed humans differently than nature, so the purpose of humans is different than that of nature. However, there is a purpose for which humans are designed, and our free will, if left unchecked, would prevent us from living in that natural state that God designed us for.
Okay.
Yeah.
God being Allah.
Yes, Allah is just the Arabic name for God. There is debate as to whether Allah is just the contraction al-ilah, meaning the God, or it's an abbreviation of Allahumma, who was one of the historic deities in the Arab pantheon, and then the other members of the pantheon got whittled away. But within Islamic belief, Allah is the same God as worshipped by Jews and Christians, right? The question as to whether epistemically, right, if we define how Jews give the attributes of God and how Christians give attributes of God and how Muslims give attributes of God, there are inconsistencies in those attributes, right? So Jews, Muslims, and Christians don't all necessarily worship the same character, but Muslims believe that they worship the same character. That's an aspect of Islamic belief. And so at the fundamental level, Islam breaks into 5 pillars. I've included the 6th because according to some types of Shiite Islam, there is a 6th pillar, and we would need to talk about jihad anyway. The first pillar is called shahada, or testimony. And the shahada is the declaration that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger, right? In Islam, there is this fundamental belief that there is only one God, and we're going to discuss this idea of unity later. It's called Tawhid. And that God sends revelations to mankind through messengers. These messengers are given books, and then those books are given to the people. And there are 5 messengers. Muhammad is the final messenger, and he gave the final book, the Qur'an, which is designed to hold all the other books together. It is a fundamental aspect of Islamic belief that you hold these 2 principles, that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger.
Is the Quran supposed to be written by Allah? Was it written by Allah?
Yes.
Or written by Muhammad?
Yes. According to Islamic belief, Muhammad was an intermediate force through which the Quran was brought to mankind. The Quran itself is an aspect of divinity, right? It is not a divinely inspired text. It is God's word. And Muhammad's role in this act of prophecy is being a functional loudspeaker, right? So God put the words into Muhammad, and Muhammad then expressed them. But for example, if you compare it to biblical books, right? God provides a revelation, and then the characters in the story, right, Moses or Jeremiah, whoever these prophets are, they provide the revelation as they understand it in their own words. This is not that case. The Quran is a book imposed by God through Muhammad into our universe. The second pillar is salat, or prayer, and Muslims believe that it is required to pray 5 times per day. The exact times that those are set by the different schools. In fact, the Sunnis pray at 5 distinct moments of the day, whereas the Shiites tend to bunch the first one, then the second and third one together, and then the 4th and 5th one together. So they actually pray in 3 different batches, but they have 5 total prayers. And there are also distinctions as to how you're supposed to pray, when you're supposed to pray, but within Islam, it's agreed that you are supposed to pray 5 times per day. And the direction of this prayer has to be towards Mecca. In the Quran, it mentions that the direction of prayer, or the Qibla, the direction of prayer has to be towards Mecca. So Muslims everywhere in the world have prayed towards Mecca, and there have actually been numerous historical disputes as to which direction Mecca is because of the curvature of the earth, changing in the degree to which compasses are accurate in terms of determining east versus west. Like, for example, there's a huge question, right? The quickest distance from New York to Mecca would be to fly north, right? We know this from every flight to Europe goes over Greenland, right? It doesn't go straight across because the distance over the curvature of the earth is shorter if you go up to the poles, right? So there's a huge question, right? If you're praying to Mecca, do you face the shortest distance as the crow flies, or do you stretch it out sort of like a Mercator projection and then look at the closest diagonal? No, this is a huge question, right? And of course,
but it's not a question, because when this all was devised, that wasn't known.
Right, but
that's modern.
Right, of course, that's a modern interpretation of this issue, but but the Qibla is still an important issue today. In the past, right, we have, for example, in Marrakesh, there's a mosque called the Qutubiyya, or rather, there's a tower called the Qutubiyya. The mosque to which it adjoined no longer stands. But the Qutubiyya, we can actually see that it was demolished all the way to the ground and rebuilt at a slightly different angle, because the Almohad dynasty that took over power believed that it was not properly oriented towards Mecca, that the compass direction was off. And so they recalibrated the entire mosque by destroying it to the ground and rebuilding it in a slightly different angle, right? So these pillars of faith actually have real world implications. The next one is zakat, or almsgiving. The Sunnis believe that it should be 2.5% of your income. The Shiites believe it should be 10% of your income. And this income should go to the mosque. The mosque will then distribute it as a welfare fund to those in the community who need that money. Zakat is still practiced by Muslims everywhere. And during the early Islamic empires, this often became a way of creating a backdoored welfare system for the most indigent members of society. Of course, there are questions of corruption and pilfering by the various rulers of the time, but generally speaking, zakat was handled by the religious institutions and given back to the Muslim community members who needed it. Zakat was generally not given to non-Muslims. But it was also not collected from non-Muslims. So then you have Sawm, or fasting. Muslims believe that they have to fast during the month of Ramadan, the month of the hot sands. And that fast will be from dawn until dusk for those 30 days. The act of fasting is designed to make the person pure and connect back to God. This fast is celebrated at the end with a holiday called Eid al-Fitr, or Ramazan Bayrama in other parts of the world. And Eid al-Fitr is a massive feast that people come and visit their families, and it's a massive break fast after the 30 days are complete. The last of the 5 major pillars of Islam is the Hajj, or pilgrimage. If a Muslim has the ability, he's financially able, and the situation is peaceful and viable, he has an obligation to go to Mecca once in his life. And this trip to Mecca is at a specific time of the year, and there are specific rituals that he has to perform when he goes on to the Hajj. Probably the most important is to circumambulate the Kaaba, or the black stone. But there are other ones, such as going to the well of Zamzam, which is believed to be the place where Hagar, the first wife / concubine of Abraham, got a well of water to feed Ishmael after she was kicked out of the house by Sarah, right? Because Islam takes from the same corpus of literature as Judaism and Christianity, except they follow the Ishmael story. And so in the desert, in Saudi Arabia, because they made it that far, Ishmael needed water, and so God revealed a well to them, and so this well, of course, has spiritual significance. Finally,
can you explain who Ishmael was?
Sure. If we go back to the biblical patriarchs, right, you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right, in the Christian and Jewish canon. Abraham had 2 important children. The Bible and the Qur'an both recognize the existence of the 2 children. He had a first wife named Sarah, who was his primary wife, and he had a second wife named Hagar, who was his concubine, since Sarah was considered too old to conceive. The Bible ages her at 90. So now Hagar had a son, Ishmael, and eventually Sarah conceived, right? And the entire idea is that the name Isaac means laughter, because she thought it was so ridiculous that she could have a child at the age of 90. But because she now had a child, the biblical narrative tells us, and the Quran accepts this narrative, that Sarah commanded Abraham to kick Hagar out of the house, and Abraham did this. So now Hagar and her son Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, are kicked out of the house, and they're wandering the desert, and they have no food and no water. They've run out. And so the angel Gabriel comes to her and reveals a well to her. And that's this well of Zamzam, which is very close to where the Black Stone is in Mecca. So when somebody does a pilgrimage, they go to the Black Stone, they go to this well. There are a number of specific prayers that they're supposed to perform in this process, and then they return home. And as I said, the last.
Well, wait, so
Yeah.
the Jews don't believe in Ishmael?
The Jews believe that Ishmael existed, but they don't believe in the story of the well of Zamzam.
Oh, they don't believe in that. So where the black stone is there actually a well there?
There's a well a few kilometers away.
Oh.
Could you please name these 4 books which go before the Quran?
I'm gonna get there. I have a whole slide on it.
Okay. Okay.
So, Richard, where is Blackstone also the place Abraham sacrificed Isaac?
According to Jewish tradition, Abraham sacrificed Isaac on Mount Moriah, which is where the Temple Mount now stands, right in the center of Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
According to Islamic sources, Abraham sacrificed Ishmael, not Isaac. He went back into Saudi Arabia and he found Ishmael and he sacrificed him. I don't know if Ishmael was sacrificed at the Black Stone, though. I don't think he was, but Islamic sources are not very clear, at least as far as I've seen, on how that event exactly took place. All right, and so the last Shiite pillar is jihad, and jihad is also a very important part of Sunni Islam. It's just not a pillar. And the jihad is broken up into 2 categories: the lesser jihad, or the jihad al-asghar, and the greater jihad, or the jihad al-akbar. In terms of what we're going to see in history, we're going to see much more of the lesser jihad, because that's naturally going to affect politics a lot more. We're going to see why. But the greater jihad is what Muslims in most societies will most often talk about. And the greater jihad, because jihad means struggle. So the greater jihad is overcoming your internal demons, your internal problems, your internal failures, and becoming a better person, right? So character modification, growth, and development. That's the greater jihad. The lesser jihad is to change political will. So this is what is often seen as holy war, but it doesn't need to be war. It can be activism. It can be legislative voting. It can be sending letters. Any form of political activism to change the world and address the grievous wrongs in the world, the struggle in the world to bring about good, is jihad. So naturally, whenever it came time for a Muslim ruler to declare war, making that war a jihad, making that war a holy war, in addition to just an internecine conflict, was very helpful in terms of getting the loyalty of Muslim subjects who felt that this was a way that they could practice their obligation to perform jihad if they were able. So we have these 2 forms of jihad, but of course, because lesser jihad is political, we're going to see much more of the lesser jihad.
As you have noticed, and you know, knowing from the history, jihad as an inner, would you say it's an inner struggle, so to speak, with your own, I don't know, let's say somebody parked the car incorrectly and you just basically, forgiveness is part of the jihad too, or?
Yeah, exactly. If we're talking about the greater jihad, forgiveness, understanding, compassion, developing these positive character attributes would be considered part of the greater jihad. Absolutely.
Got it.
Because of Arab influence, clothing that started in the Arab world has become part and parcel of how we recognize Muslims. On the left, we can see a man, and we often don't talk about Muslim male clothing, so I wanted to do so a little bit here. The white undergarment is called a thawb, and the thawb is very popular in Saudi Arabia. It's very loose-fitting clothing, and it allows air to come in. On top of it, you can see the sort of brown and golden cloak he wears over it. That's called a bisht. And the bisht is used as a symbol of either nobility or royalty. Increasingly, it's been used sort of as a fashion statement, but it's used by people to signal that they are more important, or the same way that you would wear a blazer in Western society. You can see on his head, he has the ghawrak, which is the black circle, and underneath he has the kifaya, or the kufiyah, which is the white sort of handkerchief that sits under the ghawrak. Now, these particular dressing styles are still used in Arabia. Some people mix it. Some dress in a Western style, some dress in this. I would say it's about 50-50 in most countries. If you're talking about local indigenous people. Outside of Arabia, you can see this kind of clothing, especially the thawb, in more traditional areas, right? In traditional areas in Pakistan and traditional areas in Northern Africa, people still wear the thawb.
Particularly for the men's clothing, are there laws as to, are some people not allowed to wear certain elements and other people are?
As far as I'm aware, no. Men's clothing, similar to women's clothing, under Islamic law should not be body conforming, in the sense of it should be hanging loose on the body, right? So that way you don't get, so that you don't entice somebody sexually because of your appearance. But other than that, there's no requirement in Islamic law as to the particular shape of men's clothing. When it comes to women's clothing, there are questions about what you should cover, what you shouldn't cover, but in terms of like, can you wear this color? Can you wear a bisht? Can you not wear a bisht? Do you have to be a certain level to wear a ghawrak and a kifaya below it? Every style is fine. It's personal preference. On the women's clothing, hijab is probably the most famous. The chadur is a style of hijab that sort of flows into a lower gown or abaya. The chadur and abaya are the same thing. Chadur is the Persian name, abaya is the Arabic name. In Iran today, chadur or hijab is a legal requirement for women. You have the niqab, which is the covering that goes from the nose and below and covers the mouth. And you have the burqa, which doesn't really exist in the Middle East. It's primarily in Afghanistan, which covers the entire face, and only the woman can only see through netting on the face. The Qur'an doesn't really mention the hijab itself. The Qur'an mentions that in one line that when entering Muhammad's tent, one of the women stood behind the curtain. And hijab also means curtain, it means veil. So from that line, this type of women's clothing has been taken, and there's a lot of jurisprudence on it. But in the original sources, in the Qur'an and the early Hadith, we don't see a lot of female face coverings mentioned.
Well, Richard,
yeah.
What you just described about, being behind a curtain, that doesn't explain the head covering, which I think is very important. The head, right?
Right. The idea was that these women were covering their faces behind the curtain when they spoke to these other men.
Yes, okay.
So it's the idea that the men shouldn't see the face. Now, of course, the jurisprudence over the centuries expanded it to the idea that the hair of a woman, the face of a woman, all of these attributes would sexually inspire men, and therefore, as an act of modesty, women should cover up. But this, as I said, is a historical development. This is not, Islam was not revealed in a day, for want of a better term, if we look at it from an anthropological sense. And so women's clothing is actually development through time. It's not a consistent thing.
So, Richard?
Yeah.
So people seem to argue that this women's clothing comes from Islam. Some say it's cultural and has nothing to do with Islam. What's your thought?
I don't think that it's black or white. It certainly has something to do with Islam, because you see it in places where the non-Muslim population doesn't wear it, right? So that would not happen if it had nothing to do with Islam. Now, at the same time, most people in most cultures around the world wore some sort of head covering. So it was a ubiquitous feature and it has something to do with culture, but I don't think that it's exclusively a cultural phenomenon because it has the religious backing, but I don't think it's exclusively a religious thing because it developed over time and different requirements were imposed by different governments at different moments, right? If we, one of the most common things that people like to do is take a picture of Egypt, in 1960s and contrast it with a picture of Egypt today. And you'll see Egypt in the 1960s, practically no women were wearing head coverings. There's even, it went around Arab Twitter for a while. There was a clip of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was president of Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s. And there was a man who said that, you know, women should be veiled, and he just starts laughing. Right? Like, it's so absurd. Why would you think women would be veiled? And of course, today, if you take a picture of Egypt, over half the women you'll see are veiled, right? So it's in many cases, it has this political dimension, it has this religious dimension, it has this cultural dimension. It's not any one of those things. It's sort of all of those things in the pot together.
Richard, and I know you're going to probably come to that, but does Sharia has any kind of guidance to that, or there's also...
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I will discuss it, but yes, the Sharia definitely has guidance as to how a woman should cover up. The question,
Richard,
the question is which Sharia you follow, and which scholar interpreting the Sharia you want to follow. Yes.
Question about the historical origin of Muhammad. What is accepted as Muhammad as a human?
We actually, this is the funny thing. The only sources we have about Muhammad's actual life are from the Islamic sources. We have almost no information from non-Islamic sources about who Muhammad was. Almost there are a number of non-Islamic sources that mention the Muslims in the early period, but none of them that mention Muhammad himself. So we're going to get to that. So
thank you.
Yeah. The next thing is this is just sort of a nomenclature thing. Because Muslims have that prayer requirement 5 times a day, one of the things that we typically see in Islamic cities or cities with large Muslim populations is a large number of small mosques or masjids. You can see on the left-hand side, this is Muslim Jamia. This is a small mosque. It can probably seat about 100 people. And these kinds of mosques you can find almost on every other city block if you go to one of these countries, because basically in the middle of the day, you have to get up from your job for 10 minutes, go to the mosque, and then go back. And of course, as architectural wonders and in terms of being centers of Islamic scholarship and religious rulership, you had what were called the Jamia, which were the large mosques. And you can see Sultan Ahmed Jamia, or the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. And you can sort of compare the size, right? Sultan Ahmed Jamia has the ability to seat tens of thousands of people, and has its own libraries and its scholars, and it's a huge center for Islam in Turkey. So you can sort of compare these two.
Richard, is it a requirement to go to mosque, or one could do it on the street, in his house and so on? Or it depends on whether mosque is available?
It's more about whether the mosque is available. So a lot of times you'll see Muslims praying on the street. It's usually because of overflow. So the local mosque isn't big enough for the amount of Muslims who want to go there, and so people just pray on the street. You also have the situation where, you know, there's traffic. And within Sunni Islam, the time of prayer is fixed. It's based on where the sun is in the sky. So it's like the prayer time might be, you know, 12:03 in the afternoon, right? And so you have to pray then. So if you're in the middle of traffic, okay, like everybody will just stop and people get out and put their prayer mats on the ground and they pray and then they get back in the car. So it's a combination of those sort of factors. But of course, in the ancient period and the medieval period, this was much less of an issue, right? Because you weren't traveling that far. And wherever you were, there was usually a mosque within 1 or 2 blocks of where you were, and you would just go to that mosque. You'd go to that masjid, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Jamia also serves a function of being sort of the ruler of a number of different masjids in the area in terms of organizing them, making sure that they're following fiqh and all the other major issues. I have a question. Can non-Muslims visit the mosque without offending Muslim believers? It actually depends on the country. So there are countries like Morocco where there's a long history during the French occupation of French soldiers being drunk and walking into mosques. And so Morocco made an official law that non-Muslims cannot go to a mosque, with the exception of 1 or 2 specific mosques that are designed for this. Now, in most other countries, it's permitted for non-Muslims to go. They just need to be respectful. And one of the respectfulness issues is that women use the women's section and men use the men's section. Also, there's a difference between going to a masjid, right, one of these local mosques where they're really not expecting foreigners or tourists or anything else, or going to a place like Sultan Ahmed Jamia, where of course they expect tourists to come, and so they have an entire tourism section.
Richard, yeah, sorry. Yeah. So does they have a separate of different Shiite or Sunnis mosque? Can Sunni go to Sikh or Sikh go to Sunni? Is there any cross mix?
Generally speaking, yes. A Sunni can go to a Shiite mosque and a Shiite can go to a Sunni mosque. The prayer is the same. There is a difference in terms of how the khutbah or sermon will be delivered because of the different emphases in those two doctrines. So most would say if you are in an area where the only mosque is of the other one, you should go, but you shouldn't do it as a regular behavior.
So they all welcome, put this way, you know, they all welcome each other. Just like a Catholic can go to Protestant church.
Well, actually, Catholics can't go to Protestant churches.
Yeah, I can go. Okay.
No, with the Catholics, the issue is that the Eucharist or the holy wafer that the priest blesses in Catholicism undergoes transubstantiation. It becomes the flesh and blood of Christ, right? The wafer and the wine. Under the Protestant view, it is only consubstantiation, that it takes on the metaphorical nature of the flesh and blood, and therefore it is not truly the consumption of the flesh and blood of Christ that is required under the required in the Bible, and therefore a Catholic cannot attend Protestant Mass. We have the holy book, the Qur'an. The Qur'an was first revealed without vowels and without markings. You can see the earliest versions of the Qur'an, like the blue Qur'an of Kairouan. On the right-hand side, you can see there are no dots, no dashes, whereas you can see on the modern Quran, on the left-hand side, you have numerous dots, dashes, marks, everything. And this has led to what are called qira'at, or readings. Only two major qira'at survive, and it depends on the way you dot and vowel these words. So you can see an example that I decided to bring up, which is Quranic verse 757. In the two qira'at that survives, Hafs, which is used by almost all Muslims around the world, and Warsh, which is used by Muslims in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. So in the Hafs version, the word is bushran, and in bushran, and in the Warsh version, it's nushuran. You can see if you look at just the skeleton of the word, it has that same looped shape on both sides. But the vowels and diacritic marks are different. And you can see in the English that it changes the meaning completely. Now, Muslims will point out that these differences are far fewer than what we would see, for example, in the Bible versions, right? Where we have entire chapters that are added or redacted. We have clear, different texts, depending on which version of the Bible we're talking about, which books are included, which books are not included. Some characters do different things. The Quran doesn't have this, but there are contradictions in the Quranic text. First, that come from the qira'at, having different meanings, and also from words in the Quran actually being contradictory to each other. That said, Muslims believe that the Quran is infallible and lacks these contradictions. And to the extent that there are contradictions, there's a doctrine called naskh, or abrogation. And this doctrine says that if you have two Quranic verses, the one that came later in time supersedes the one that came earlier in time. Muslims also believe, as I said, that the Quran is the word of God in the very literal sense of that term. And so it is against their tradition for the Quran to sit on the floor. Accordingly, they have what's called the rahil. You can see it there in the picture. And the Quran will be placed on this rahil, on this holder, while reading and preserving it. We have rahils that still survive, that are over 1,000 years old in different places. The blue Quran of Kairouan, you can see a picture of here, is over 1,000 years old, and is kept in the Tunisian museum, because Kairouan is in Tunisia. Any questions about the Quran?
Yeah, I have a question. So it's very similar to, recently I'm doing this presentation on the Volga Bulgars and the Khazars. It's interesting, in Jewish religion, and they bury the books that had Hebrew writings on it because it's not allowed to be thrown or stuff like that. So it's very similar to the fact of preservation of the books. And then you're also not supposed to be putting in certain places the Torah. So it's an interesting parallel in that regard. Also, I remember one of your oldest presentations, you have mentioned that due to the certain interpretations of the Quran, there was some misunderstanding of, certain words like, those 8 or 9 tenets of jihad and stuff like that without the dots, so to speak. How is that addressed? And I know you mentioned there's an agreed upon version, but I don't know if that's mentioned anywhere. Sorry.
As far as I'm aware, none of the differences between the Qira'at rises to the level where you would have a interpretational issue, right? Like this difference that I show in Quran 757 is probably one of the most divergent between Hafs and Warsh. Usually it's a changing of the tense, or it's a changing of the speaker, like we do something as opposed to they do something. The difference that I think I was talking about earlier was in the Jewish Bible, because the Jewish Bible was originally also printed without diacritics, and the diacritics came later. And so you had what was called Qariya and Kitiv, spoken and the written. And so using this spoken tradition, the rabbis put the vowels back onto the words, but it could very easily have been that this spoken tradition was corrupted or changed or otherwise bowdlerized. And one particular example that a lot of people like to cite to is the prohibition on cooking meat in the milk of its mother. Because the word milk is chalav and the word fat is chalev. So the only difference between chalav and chalev are the vowels. So it could be very easily the case, don't cook a kid in its mother's fat, or don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. And if it was the fat, well, then you basically can't cook any animal ever, because animals have fat, right? So there are these sort of questions about interpretation. But in terms of the Qira'at, they don't lead to many different exegetical issues. The one issue that they raise is that many Muslims who are less familiar with the history of the Quran will say that the Quran has been revealed by God and not a jot or tittle has been changed, right? That the Quran is perfectly revealed by God. And of course, if that were the case, and that we wouldn't have these Qira'at, right? This would not be an issue, but it is.
What is the oldest physical text of the Quran that exists? Do you know?
I believe that there is one from the 8th century, when it's incomplete. We also have earlier versions that have been discovered in partial areas that have not been kept by Muslims. They've been unearthed, similar to how like the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed. And similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls, when you compare those to generally accepted texts, let's say, of the Bible, there are discrepancies and differences, right? That was the whole discovery by Charles Luxemburg when he wrote about how you have versions of the Quran where words have been changed or moved around, and of course this was not taken very well by religious Muslims.
Richard,
yeah,
does Arabic read right to left like
yes.
Hebrew does?
Yes,
it does. Okay.
All right, so now that we've addressed the Quran, we now need to sort of branch out to the rest of the Sharia and the rest of what Muslims are writing about. So the first thing that we sort of have to address is this idea of called hadith. So the Quran itself is actually not a storybook, right? It's not comparable to the Bible in this way. A much better thought process would be to imagine it like the book of Proverbs. It has a number of different analytical commentaries on events that are not in the pages described. And so the Quran will jump from narrative to narrative, talking about the analysis of stories, usually from the Bible or from Arabian prophetic tradition. And so the actual events of Muhammad's life are not in the Quran. I think in the Quran he's mentioned 4 times. Right, the most mentioned people in the Quran are Moses and Jesus. So the stories of Muhammad's life are sort of broken down into sort of two categories. The first one you can see on the right-hand side is the Sirat al-Nabi, or the biography of the Prophet, which is a book written by Ibn Ishaq about 200 years after Muhammad supposedly lived. And the only version we have is the version that was redacted by Ibn Hisham. That is a cover-to-cover story of Muhammad's life, a biography of his life. Some Muslims accept it as true, some Muslims accept it as partially true. There are also what are called the hadith, or the events. And the hadith, there are about 30,000 of these events. And some of the hadith are short stories. They could be a paragraph long. Some of them are one sentence. Some of them are a page. And each of these is sort of a different moment in the Prophet's life. So, for example, the hadith up here, right, is that Muhammad had a moment where, you know, he was very afraid, and so he used to say, "I seek refuge with you," you know, and so he was healed. And so, a Muslim might say, "Okay, this is the thing that Muhammad did. I should say this thing too if I'm in a similar state of fear or panic, because Muhammad is an example to others." So as I said, there are about 30,000 of these hadiths. The problem, of course, in early Islamic history, starting in the 800s and moving later into history, is that most Muslims were sure that the majority of these hadiths were interpolations. They were creations by individuals who wanted to establish their own personal beliefs into the corpus of Islamic behavior and law. So there were different hadith collectors who judged the hadiths based on whether they were strong and healthy, sahih, whether they were weak, and sort of split them into these categories, or acceptable between them. And most of the hadith collectors basically said that 1 in 10 of these hadiths were healthy, but they didn't necessarily agree on which 1 in 10 there are. And so different groups of Sunnis and Shiites have come around to different collections. The one on the right is Sahih al-Bukhari. The al-Bukhari was a man who lived in the city of Bukhara and once now modern-day Uzbekistan, and this was his collection of sahih, or healthy hadiths. He had about 8,000 to 9,000 hadiths in this collection, and most Sunnis consider it to be the most authoritative collection of hadiths. On the left-hand side, in the Persian manuscript, this is Naj al-Balagha, and Naj al-Balagha is one of the most reputable Shiite collections of hadiths. Now, there is an overlap between the ones that al-Bukhari and the Naj al-Balagha agree upon, but there is also dissonance. And one of the dissonances is that the Naj al-Balagha focuses on Ali to a certain extent, and we'll see why that is as we go through this. But accordingly, we should understand that the hadith collections and the understandings of what happened in Muhammad's life actually differ between the sects and can differ by individuals depending on which hadiths they choose to accept or reject. The picture on the left is Muqamat al-Tuyur, or the Conference of the Birds. The Conference of the Birds is a Sufi text, and I highly recommend you read it if you want to understand what Sufism is about, because Sufism is not a rejection of the Sunni-Shiite divide. It is actually a more mystical understanding as opposed to a literal understanding. We'll get to that in a bit.
Richard,
yeah.
The bio of Muhammad,
yeah.
does it go into after Muhammad died?
It does not.
It doesn't, okay.
No.
Because that's when you get the split between Shia and Sunni, right?
Yeah, the split between Shia and Sunni happens in the successorship, but it doesn't happen immediately. It slowly develops. And we're going to address that, if not next week, then the week after. Yeah, so Muqamat al-Tuyur, the Conference of the Birds, is a Sufi book. And the Sufis use the story in the Qur'an, which is that King Solomon wanted to invite the Queen of Sheba in Ethiopia to come to visit him in Jerusalem. And so Solomon, knowing the language of the birds, he spoke to the birds, and the birds went to Ethiopia. They contacted the Queen of Sheba and brought her to Jerusalem to visit with King Solomon. Now, using that as a metaphor, the Sufis wrote about how the birds had to fly over 10 different peaks. And these peaks represented different fallacies in secular thinking, in non-religious thinking. There, for example, there's a valley where you have to surrender all rationality to love. And there's another valley where you have to surrender your understandings of the physical world for your understandings of the spiritual. Because the Sufis who were writing Maqamat al-Suyur were using these birds as a metaphor for how people cannot understand the mystical and transcendental nature of God. And so by using these sorts of metaphors, they were able to communicate that in a language that would not seem heretical and would actually interplay with the values that Islam teaches in their view. The final book I have on this page is Umud al-Salik, or Reliance of the Traveler. And Reliance of the Traveler is one of the few books of fiqh that has been translated into English. Now, fiqh is Islamic jurisprudence that is codified. So once I have my hadiths and I have my seerah, I have to start analyzing cases and coming up with what the law is on any particular issue, right? Because the Qur'an might say something in general, like for example, that it is not permissible to drink wine. The Qur'an explicitly forbids wine. But then the question is, well, what does that mean in terms of application? What counts as wine, right? And so you have this debate between different Islamic scholars or faqih, and these faqih sit back and argue with each other, what does that mean? And the majority of scholars have come to the conclusion that this means that all alcoholic beverages are prohibited, right? And so they put these rulings together in books that are designed to be effective law books, right? To understand what the Sharia is. But of course, this depends on which scholars you're following and which sect of Islam, and then below it, which school. So this is from the Shafi'i school within Sunni Islam. You have Reliance of the Traveler. And you can see, and you can flip through it, and it has the laws on very granular issues because these are the ones that have been debated. And according to Shafi'i scholars, this is the way you should understand the law. So when somebody says that they want to impose Sharia law, you should say which one, right? Because there are all these different books of the Sharia. There's not huge, massive differences between them, but it's like, are you going to apply American law or Canadian law or British law? They're similar, certainly, but they're not the same. As we talked about before, Muhammad's life is not attested outside of Islamic sources. We really don't know much about pre-Islamic Arabia outside of what the Islamic sources tell us. And the Islamic sources tell us about a man who received revelation at Mount Hira when he was 40 years old. He had miraculous experiences like the ride on top of the Burak. You can see on the right-hand side, the Burak is this sort of flying, faced Pegasus. He, of course, lived in Mecca, and at that time, the Kaaba was being circumambulated, and in the center of it, there were numerous idols. And so the life of Muhammad, as we pointed out with the Sirah and the Hadith, is very important in understanding what Islam teaches, because Muhammad is the perfect example in Islam. Okay.
Richard, is there has any standard book of Hira, or is a certain version considered as a correct version
of the Sirah?
No, the about the Muhammad's life.
Yeah, the Sirah.
Is that one book or just a story have many books?
Okay, so the Sirah is considered authoritative on Muhammad's life, but there are a lot of people who reject the authenticity of it. And there are different reasons for doing so. Some because they don't like what it says. Some because they point out that it was written 200 years after he died, so the details are more difficult to parse. Some who reject it because it was redacted, right? It was written by Ibn Ashaq, but redacted by Ibn Hisham. So, and that's the only version we have. So we don't know what other details Ibn Ashaq would have given us. And we can tell.
But among the Muslim world, there's only one version of Hira.
Yes, there's only one version of the Sirah. But the thing is that the Hadith collection also tells stories about Muhammad's life, right? But the Sirah is like a novel, right? You can read it cover to cover, and it will take you through day one to the end. The hadith are these little stories.
Yeah.
Have you read it, Richard?
I've read parts of the Sirah. I haven't read the whole thing. It's like 600 pages.
Oh.
How many pages?
Around 600.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Why we can watch a movie or something?
Or the manga.
So one of the things is that because the Quran was revealed in Arabic, Muslims believe that only the Arabic language can be used to understand the Quran, because since these are literally God's words, the meaning is encoded in the language, and therefore the act of translating it is an act of removing that level of divine connection. So you can have you can title them as translations, but almost always they're accompanied by the Arabic, because only the Arabic is considered a true Quran. Now, you can see the Arabic language is a language that can modify itself to have very distinct meanings based solely on the orientation of the letters. And you can see here, we have one root, QTA, which is qata, but with all these different interpolations, it has all these different meanings that are related, but very uniquely specific. And a lot of Quranic interpreters will begin to use this sort of understanding to try and parse out what God's meaning is, because the language of the Quran is very high level and uses a lot of these very specific linguistic changes. All right. Now, onto the belief of unity. So Islam believes that there is only one God, right? We have the Shahada in the upper right-hand corner. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. We also have one of the most commonly recited surahs or chapters of the Quran, which is called Surah Al-Ikhlas, or chapter 112. And you can see that the surah is itself a narration of God's attributes and a specific refutation of the claim that Jesus made, right? God is one God, the eternal God. He begetteth not, neither is he begotten, right? Of course, that's the whole idea of God begat Jesus, right? So it's a refutation of this idea that that Jesus is not God, and there's not anyone like unto him. And conversely, if Tawhid, this idea of unity of God, is the primary belief that Muslims should have, the negative of that is shirk, or the association of others with God. So shirk is discussed as praying to anything that is not God, like other gods, kings and queens, statues, fire, which is what they understood about Zoroastrian belief, the sun or the sky. And one of the interesting things is that in Islam, all sins are forgivable by God except for the sin of shirk, right? You can see the quote from Surah An-Nisa, so 449, chapter 448, which is that Allah can forgive any sin except for shirk. He can't forgive this idea of breaking unity and believing in others along with God.
So Richard, it sounds to me almost like it came along as almost like a reformation, because first you had in the Mideast the Jews who believed the same thing about God, just one God, immutable, blah, blah, blah. And then Christianity divided God into three things. So then Mohammed comes along and says, and goes back to the Hebrew version, which is just the one. You know what I mean?
No, that's exactly right. And Muslims actually made that argument that Muhammad saw himself as a reformer, right? He, in the argument of Muhammad and in the argument of most Muslims with regards to Muhammad, Muhammad was not introducing a new faith. He was returning to the faith as it was supposed to have been, right? And so this idea that he was reconfirming the Jewish idea of the unity of God is exactly what Muhammad would have said if you asked him. One of the things that,
Richard,
yeah.
So shirk is a sin, right? Just like idoler, right? Idol worshiping.
It includes idol worship, but it is the worship of anything alongside God.
Okay, so you cannot associate God with anything else.
Yes, there's
like a cloud, fire, sky, sun. That's all called shirk. Right?
That's exactly right. You can't like God is beyond description and beyond a visualization. Muslims have a very strong iconoclastic bent, specifically because of this issue. And there is painting and artistry that exists, especially in Shiite Islam and to a smaller degree in Sunni Islam. But there is a strong pressure to not depict, even in Shiite Islam, where you do have, for example, paintings of Muhammad. There's a strong pressure to not depict God in any way. Specifically because of this idea that you would be idolizing him or engaging in some form of shirk by displaying God through one of these metaphors.
So Tawhid, right, means
Tawhid.
God is the one. That's the one we have to follow, right?
Yes.
Okay. So one is virtue, one is sin. So
yeah. As we mentioned before, right, Muhammad was a reformer. He believed that he was returning back to the original faith and sort of bringing it, correcting all of the errors that the previous prophets had made and that people had understood from the previous prophets. So he was the perfection and the capstone, meaning that he was the end of the prophets. He would be the last prophet. There would be no one after him because he got the message correct. And he corrected all the previous prophets who had somehow garbled the message, right? And the people who followed them misunderstood the message. Now, Islam also argues that there were 124,000 prophets who went to the various corners of the world before Muhammad. And so Muhammad is the final capstone for all of that prophecy. Everything should feed into Islam. The previous traditions, Judaism, Christianity, they all feed into Islam. All right. So then that sort of leads into how did Islam see prior religions? Now the Qur'an itself mentions Judaism, Christianity, and Sabianism. Sabianism, we're not entirely sure what they were referring to by that. They could be referring to the modern religion that calls themselves Sabians, that numbers about 3,000 in Iraq today. They could be referring to a version of Mandeanism or Manichaeism. But Judaism and Christianity, we understand. And those three religions were called Ahl al-Kitab, or the people of the book, because they had received revelations before. They were sort of grandfathered in to this divine situation, right? Their view of what God was somewhat in line with Islam. Now, of course, Islam was the perfection, right? Islam was the right answer, but these people were permitted to continue believing their religions because their religions were in the ambit of what was acceptable for divinity. Other religions that Muslims encountered, like Buddhism, Manichaeism, Yazidism, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism, were, of course, outside of that fold.
Excuse me, Richard, you mean Judaism, Christian are allowed to continue, right?
Yes.
And what else?
And Sabianism.
Oh, Sabianism. Okay.
The problem is we don't know what Sabianism was when they're referring to it, because if it could be the religion that still exists today, it could be something else.
Richard, can you talk about like the three Abrahamic religions? Like you were saying that Muhammad was saying that his religion was the right one. Mm-hmm. It was a revision and an improvement over the other two.
Correct.
And that he was right, which of course is like where all the tragedy of religion comes in. When one religion denies the other religions, that the other religions are possible. So say like Christianity and Judaism, do they also claim to be in other words, to what extent does religion allow for the existence of other religions without going out on a crusade to kill them all?
Right. No, Judaism and Christianity are much less accepting of Islam than Islam has been of Christianity and Judaism. Now, of course, times have changed. Politics are different now because of the Enlightenment and developments in Western countries. But historically, Jews struggled with integrating into majority Christian and majority Muslim societies. They had an easier time integrating into majority Muslim societies because of this grant of acceptance, this idea that they were people of the book. And so Judaism tended to look more favorably upon Islam throughout its history than it did to Christianity. Within the last, let's say, 100 years, because of changes in the West and the creation of the State of Israel and the political implications from both of those changes, more Jews tend to be sympathetic towards Christianity than tend to be sympathetic towards Islam today. But if you look at, for example, the writings of Rambam, right, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, he writes very favorably about Islam and much less favorably about Christianity. And you see that almost across the board from that time period. Christianity, to the extent when they were under Islamic rulers, generally were in favor of the Muslim governments. We're going to discuss that as a historical phenomenon as we move through the history. But Christianity, of course, outside of the Islamic world often saw Islam as a threat. But of course, those two things are not consistent. There are cases where Christians within Islamic states aided Christians outside of the Islamic states, and there are cases where Christians outside of the Islamic states turned to Muslims to fight against Christians. So there is a lot of confluence based on real politic factors over these sort of constructivist notions, we could say.
Well, say like Christ himself.
Right.
He went around saying he was the Son of God.
Right.
Did he allow that many people didn't believe that, and that's okay?
He didn't really have the power to say one way or the other. He would, like, the best way to understand Jesus is as a hippie, right? He didn't have political power or influence. The power of the church grew after he died, and it took about 200 years for the early church to amass enough of a following to actually wield any sort of political power. So it's not the right question. But,
oh, I see.
But if you're talking about what do the Gospels say, Jesus said, any person who does not forsake his brother is not worthy of me. Right? Like, Jesus made it very, and he said, I am the truth, the light, and the way. So it's very clear within Christian doctrine that there's no salvation but through Christ.
Right.
So anyway, but if we go back to Islam, right, so the Jews and the Christians and the Sabians are grouped under this people of the book category, and the other religions were what were called mushrikeen, right, those who practice shirk. Mushrikeen, the polytheists, those who practice shirk. Now, this became a huge problem when Zoroastrianism, which was the dominant faith of Iran came under Islamic control very early into Islamic history, and you had roughly 20 million Persians. There was no way that they could be forcibly converted. There just wasn't the manpower to do it. And so we begin to see off and on that Zoroastrianism gets grandfathered into this people of the book category because otherwise you couldn't govern. We also see in India, when you start to have large Muslim states in India, that Hinduism at various times will be grandfathered into this people of the book, which is particularly surprising for anybody who knows what Hinduism believes, because they would be the paramount characters of shirk, right? Like that, like if shirk describes anything, it is lighting fires to idols, believing in multiple gods, praising the sun and the things that exist in. Now, of course, there are versions of Hinduism that don't believe in gods, that are atheistic, but generally speaking, if we talk about the general corpus of Hindu doctrine, you're talking about a religion that would fall under the definition of shirk. But Muslim rulers had to accommodate the fact that they were ruling an empire that was mostly Hindu. So they would find ways to bend the rules to sort of grandfather them into this people of the book group. But then, of course, you had rulers who were more stringent and went on purges internally, trying to kill off those who would not convert to Islam. Those incidents of bloody forcible conversion were rare, especially when you compare it to Christianity, but they did occur. All right. So now to Mikhail's question, here are the 5 books. Now, Islam believes that these 5 books were revealed at different points of history. Now, remember, in the Islamic idea, these messengers brought down the books from God. So these are actually divine instruments. They are not inspired by revelations of God. They are themselves the revelation. So the first book was brought down by Abraham and is called Suhuf Ibrahim, the Scrolls of Abraham. Muslims have tried to recreate this text. We don't have any extant versions. And you can see in the upper right-hand side the story of Abraham smashing the idols in his father Terach's workshop. This is a central motif, of course, in Islam, and the idea of the Suhuf Ibrahim is to promote this idea of breaking away from idol worship, right? Because this is Abraham embracing Tawhid and rejecting Shirk. Then, of course, you have the Tawrat, or the Torah, the Jewish Torah that was brought down by Moses. You have the Zabur, or the Psalms of King David. You have the Injil, or the Gospel. Now, what's interesting to note is that the Islamic conception of the Injil is not the 4 Gospels that we have in the Christian Bible. The Islamic conception of the Injil is a book revealed by Jesus himself. Because remember, in the Islamic conception, Jesus is the Messiah, but Jesus is not himself God, right? Because that would violate the concept of Tawhid. So Jesus himself was a messenger, and he brought this Injil book to reveal things about reality to the people. And according to Islam, the people misunderstood the Injil. And that was one of the reasons that Muhammad had to come, right? In fact, according to the Islamic understanding of Jesus, Jesus was never crucified. It was Judas Iscariot who was crucified. Jesus was in hiding, in occultation, and remains in hiding to this day, which is why I have that joking poster. Can I find Jesus if he's hiding? Because in the Muslim conception, Jesus is still alive. He is in hiding, waiting for the moment that the end of the world will come. And the Mahdi, one of the leaders of the world in the Islamic end times, will unite with Jesus. Jesus will proclaim Islam as the one true faith, and they will fight together the Dajjal, or Antichrist. And of course, the final of the 5 books is the Qur'an that Muhammad brought down himself, also just reciting God's words. And so we can sort of see how these books follow in sequence. In the Islamic mindset, these were all divine creations that came through these people to humanity.
So, Richard, so the first 4 books, all through revelation, only Muhammad is direct from the God. Is that right?
All of these books were directly from God. However, the versions that we have preserved, most Muslims will say, have been corrupted over time. That they were not properly preserved. And so that's why, for example, the Jewish Torah might say things that contradict the Qur'an, right? It's because the Qur'an retains the correct understanding from heaven, and the Jews have corrupted the Torah to agree with their own pre-established beliefs.
So that's why to interpret the Quran, the later version had to precede the previous version. That's why they keep this way.
Yes.
This logic.
Yes.
And Richard, you're saying that the scrolls of Abraham, it's referred to, but nobody's ever seen them. They don't exist.
Correct.
I think I read the story about it. Talk about the Abraham's father is a Syrian idol. And Abraham destroyed the idol. I don't know where it's come from.
Yeah.
Okay.
The original source of that is a Jewish midrash, or a Jewish apocryphal story about the Bible, but it has become part of Islamic belief about who Abraham was, that he smashed the idols of his father. As for the scrolls, the thing is that we don't actually know what document it is that Muslim theologians were referring to. We have modern books that are called the Scrolls of Abraham, and they date some of them to later than this time. We don't have earlier versions, so we don't know if they're referring to those books or not. They could be referring to a different book that we've just simply lost to time.
And there is no mention in the Old Testament about those, right?
Correct. The funny thing is that in the Old Testament, there are mentions to many books that we don't have. Like some of the books, for example, Judges refers to the books of war or something similar to that. We've never seen what those books are, but there are references in the Bible to books that don't exist as well.
So in other words, Abraham wrote. He wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So now I thought this is sort of how the sects divide. This is sort of my simplified map. This is the more complicated map. And we're definitely going to move through this more slowly as time goes on, because we'll see these parts coming apart. But you can see that within Islam, there are sort of 4 sectarian groups, right? You have the Sunni and the Shia, which account for over 95% of all Muslims today. But you also have Ahmadiyya, you have Khawarija, you have Quranists, you have non-denominationals, and they fit outside of this system. And then you can see below, on the second level, below Sunni and Shia, you can see the schools. So under Sunni, you have the 4 major schools, Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi'i. And under Shia, you have the 3 major schools, Ismaili, Jafari, and Zaydi. And of course, as we move through the history, we'll discuss in more detail. The Sufi orders sort of impose on top of these doctrinal divides. So it's not, so somebody could be, for example, Mawlawi while being Hanafi, or Mawlawi while being Shafi'i. That's just how these things will fit together. Okay.
Hey, Richard?
Yeah.
I understand that the Sufi, are they not in Turkey?
Sufi are everywhere.
Oh, everywhere. Okay. And so there's no geographic concentration for Sufi.
There are places where there are more Sufi than others. For example, the Bektashi movement, which is one of the Sufi movements, you can see on the upper left-hand side of the box of Bektashi. The Bektashi movement, for example, is really popular in Albania and Bosnia, and to a lesser extent in Turkey, right? And like in Albania, I think about 20% of the population identifies as Bektashi.
Okay.
Is it the ones that pierce their chicks in Albania?
I don't know if that's their tradition, but no, but so like, but you wouldn't find a Bektashi person, let's say, in Uzbekistan. It's just not going to happen. So these orders happen to be where those mystics started and where they preached, and there are a lot of historical factors, and as we move through the history, we'll see them.
And the ones on the right in the yellow, they are extinct?
Khawarij is extinct. Ibadiyya is not extinct. Ibadiyya exists in Oman. In fact, it's the dominant sect in Oman today.
So in Saudi Arabia, I know it's Wahhabism. Does the is Sufism also popular over there, or they are totally different?
Sufism is not popular in Saudi Arabia, but Wahhabism is a subcategory of Hanbali. So under Sunni, you have the school Hanbali. Within Hanbali, there are many different sort of sub-schools and traditions. And Abdul Wahhab, who lived about 250 years ago, he sort of grandfathered in this idea of how to interpret Hanbali doctrine, and that's what we call Wahhabism today, or his supporters would call Salafism.
Okay. So Wahhabism is under Hanafi, and Hanafi is under Sunni.
No, it's under Hanbali.
Hanbali, okay. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, don't worry. There's not going to be a quiz. You won't be forced to write this.
Although we're gonna have a trivia at the end, right?
But
our box is being played.
Yeah, definitely. No, the point of putting this up is to show how much diversity there is within the Islamic world. I have a question. Is Islam copying Judaism and Christianity? To a certain extent, they would say, and most Muslims would say yes, right? They're following in the same tradition. And the question also discusses how religion is used to rule society. And of course, that's certainly part of why religion develops the way it does. Now, there are functional distinctions between the various roles inside both Sunni and Shiite Islam. And one of the things that is most confusing is that the Imam in Shiite Islam, it refers to an infallible person. There's only one Imam alive at any one time, and that person has God's knowledge on the certain questions that they're being asked, right? They have a direct connection to God. In Sunni Islam, an Imam is just the local priest at your masjid. So So as long as you keep those terms separate, we'll be okay. You can notice that Islam will split power between a terrestrial ruler and a spiritual leader. We'll discuss that. And we also have a lot of different religious figures in terms of how this larger structure is organized. Like you have these faqih, right? These religious scholars, and you have qadis, who are religious judges.
So in Shia Islam, the current imam is Ali Sistani, right?
No. Ali Sistani is Nayatullah, right? He's a spiritual leader. Ali Sistani is from 12er Shiite Islam. So the 12th imam in 12er Shiite Islam is similar to Jesus. He's in hiding. He's in occultation. We don't know who he is.
Oh.
But that is the person who is the imam in 12er Shiite Islam. Other versions of Islam have different imams, and we're going to discuss how that works in a bit. So I sort of want to unpack a little bit what Sunni style governance looks like. So I have the Sultan, this is the period of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He ruled in what's now Turkey about 500 years ago. And he had the spiritual leader, the Shaykh al-Islam Abu Su'ud Effendi. And these were two leading government officials, right? Suleiman is the Sultan, and Shaykh al-Islam, and Abu Su'ud Effendi was the Shaykh al-Islam, this spiritual leader. So they had corresponding duties. So, right, the Sultan was in charge of terrestrial law. He would, for example, deal with contract law, and he would write tort law and property law and all of these sort of day-to-day terrestrial issues. And the Shaykh al-Islam would write Islamic law, things like divorce, things like waqf or Islamic land trusts. That, because like if you build a mosque in a certain place, that place always is consecrated, and so it stays in Muslim hands. There are Islamic laws about charities, right, and how those are run. And so you have these two branches of law, and each one is responsible for their branch. You have taxes, right? You have the Sultan who collects the taxes and the jizya being the tax on non-Muslims, while the Shaykh al-Islam collects the zakat. We mentioned the zakat is the almsgiving or charity that Muslims have to do as a religious obligation, right? So you have these two separate monetary collections. You have a separation in terms of how they're relating to the military. The Sultan is responsible for telling the armies where to go and promoting generals and organizing the military. But at the same time, the Sultan cannot really declare jihad. He doesn't have the religious imprimatur to have that kind of role. So it will be the Shaykh al-Islam who will publish a declaration of jihad, who will go with the soldiers and declare how this war that the Sultan has declared is a moral Islamic undertaking.
So Richard, from what you've just told us, this would argue against the Asian and Western concepts of keeping church and state separate.
Absolutely. The Islamic system in the modern period is going to be completely different, but until the modern period begins, almost every Islamic state had both secular and religious elements built together. It wasn't that the secular government overruled the religious elements, or that the religious elements overruled the secular government. They each had their own spheres of influence. And there were areas certainly of competition and overlap, but generally speaking, they kept their own separate magisteria in terms of the governance of the state. So, and the final one, right, is of course, the Sultan was responsible for educating the bureaucrats who would run the various government agencies, but the Shaykh al-Islam would be responsible for governing the education of Muslim scholars. And also the sheikhs and the qadis, the religious judges. And in many of these smaller towns, they didn't have bureaucrats. They had these religious judges. So in many ways, the qadis would be enforcing the laws of the Sultan for issues that were outside the purview of Islamic law. So you sort of have these two branches of government working quasi-harmoniously together in their separate magisteria. Of course, like any political divide, there are naturally sultans and caliphs and other leaders on the terrestrial side who acquire more power at the expense of the religious leader, and religious leaders who acquire more power at the expense of the secular leader. So how do the religious leaders come to an idea about what is the what Islam says. So the first thing that they do is they go to the Quran and they interpret it. This is called Tafsir. You can see in the lower right-hand side Tafsir al-Jalalain, and Jalalain was one Quranic commentator. This is his Tafsir. And you can see in the center the Quranic text, and on the fringes you can see written around it in Arabic his interpretations of this text and how it applies. So once you had this Tafsir, you would then go and debate it with other scholars, and they would then interpret this in what's called Filsafa, or philosophy, or Kalam, which is reasoned argumentation. And through this process, they would come together and find out what the law is and what it should represent. So this was the process of creating Islamic law. On the left-hand side, we sort of have a division within Islamic doctrine that's going to become more important as we progress. The idea about whether the Quran is co-eternal with God. So in Shiite belief and in Mu'tazilite belief, we're going to eventually see the Mu'tazilites more, the Quran is a created document in the sense that God spoke these words at a specific moment in time and then imprinted them into Muhammad. But the Quran itself is not an eternal element. God created it. The predominant view in Sunni Islam today is that the Quran is uncreated, that it is an eternal part of God, that these words were part of God's nature. And so they don't have any definitive moment of creation. There is a definitive moment when they were written down in a physical book, but there's no definitive moment when those words themselves were differentiated from God. They are a part of God. And so the debate over Quranic createdness is actually one of the major divides in early Islam.
Excuse me, Richard, I think I missed your point about the internet connection. You said that the view on the Quran, they have the created version and the uncreated version.
Yes.
And that's split between Shiite and the Sunni?
Yes.
So which one believes the created version?
The Shiites believe that the Quran was created, and the Sunnis believe that the Quran is uncreated. It's a natural element of God. All right. So one of the earliest debates, this was during the reign of Caliph Mamun, and we'll of course discuss this when we get to the reign of the Abbasids in more depth. He believed in Mu'tazilite philosophy, which prioritized rationality. And his major opponent was Ahmed ibn Hanbal, the leader of the Hanbali school, right, that we talked about before. Ahmed ibn Hanbal believed that you couldn't know through rational discussion and recourse what God meant and what God believed. Ahmed ibn Hanbal was tortured by the Caliph for his beliefs, but he still retained them. And it was his retention of those beliefs and his idea that God was unknowable and that rational ideas couldn't serve to replace Islamic spiritual knowledge that allowed the doctrine of non-createdness to survive in Sunni Islam. It also meant that the Mu'tazilite belief that led the early Abbasids would die off and be replaced predominantly by Sunni belief. It was a shift away from rational discourse and towards a greater sense of spirituality, occasionalism, and that only spiritual knowledge will save. If you remember from before, when we talked about the Conference of the Birds, this was also a Sufi belief, that you couldn't use rational knowledge to understand the world, you could only use divine knowledge. So the Islamic world, as we sort of discussed, sort of splits between those who use jurisprudence, the scholars, the faqih, the jurists who create the Sharia, right? And the Sufis, who are more mystical. Now, the Sufis don't believe in some sort of different Quran than jurists, nor is it their belief that the rules don't matter. It's just simply that that's not their focus. Their focus is on the spiritual relationship with God. Now, this has led a lot of people to believe that the jurists tend to be much more, for example, bellicose, and the Sufis are much more pacifist. This is not necessarily the case. Sufis often led soldiers into war. Sufis gained their spirituality through piety and penitence, but that did not mean that they were in any way pacifistic or naturally loving. in a way that we would associate with modern hippies, right? That's sort of a misunderstanding of what the Sufis were all about. A perfect example is, and we're going to get to it when we eventually discuss Tamerlan. Tamerlan was very closely connected to the Sufi order called Naqshbandi. And Naqshbandi Sufis marched with him and his soldiers as they performed numerous massacres, and they endorsed his actions in killing numerous other Muslims. So the idea that a Sufi order, because it is a Sufi order, is somehow loving or generous is sort of a misnomer. But their focus is not in the law itself and understanding what the law is. Their focus is in understanding who God is through metaphor and spiritual experience.
Oh, it's interesting, and maybe, obviously, forgive my ignorance. You have all this mysticism areas of otherwise saying a kind of like a black and white type of religion here, where it's written that this is allowed, this is not allowed. There's more rules than not rules. And how does it allow for, and I'm sorry if I'm using, so I guess Sufism, and then maybe the Hashashins was also completely using the Ismaili wave of, religion, also was a mystic order, so to speak. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
The Nizari Ismailis were not mystic in this way. They actually would be on the left side of this frame. They would be on the juristic side. The Sufis did follow all the rules. They prayed 5 times a day. They performed fasts during Ramadan. They made Hajj if they could make Hajj. It wasn't that they weren't following the rules. They did other rituals that were not required by the rules in order to connect to God. A perfect example of this is what's called dhikr. And dhikr meaning remembrance. So they would sit down and they would recite the 99 epithets of God, right? And they would repeat this over and over for hours and hours, because that act would put them in a meditative trance, right? And that would allow them to connect to God. Right. So it's not that they're not following the rules, it's just that's not their emphasis.
Right. And then dervishes were the ones that swirled.
Right, exactly. The dervishes, are Sufis of the Mawlawi order, or the Mevlevi order. It's called Mevlevi in Turkey, Mawlawi in Arabic. But yeah, so you can see there, they're doing that act of whirling. That act of whirling is itself a form of dhikr, right? The tempo and the way that they're whirling about is itself to remind them about the nature of God. So it's not a dance. It's a religious, ritualistic observance.
Right. So, Richard, is that possible to have the 2 sects of Muslim, let's say Shiite and the Sunni, and they belong to the same Sufism?
No, it's actually the Sufi groups are more narrow. So there are, so for example, the Mevlevi that we've been talking about is a Sunni Sufi order, and the Safavi, who eventually conquer Iran, are a Shiite Sufi order. So
Sufism is under the Islamic sect.
Yes.
Okay. So you can have the same people in the same sect, different Sufism, but you will not have the same Sufism with different sect, right?
Yes. And if you remember from this page where we showed 15 different things, there are many different orders or tariqah of Sufis.
Wait, so Sufism is neither Shia nor Sunni. Is that correct?
Sufis can be either Shiite or Sunni, or they can be in any other group, like Ibadiyya. You can have Ibadi Sufis. I don't know of any Ibadi Sufi orders, but there's nothing that would prevent it. All right, this goes sort of to Zach's point about the Ismailis. Now, one of the things that we sort of begin to discuss as we move into more of the Shiite side of philosophy is this idea of Zahiriyya and Batiniyya. Zahiriyya meaning that which is apparential, and Batiniyya that which is beneath. And it's a very difficult concept to describe until the Matrix movie came out. And I think the Matrix works really well for this metaphor, right? In the Matrix, people perceive the things around them as if they are solid objects, as if they have meaning. right? And what Neo does as he goes through the movie is that he discovers that the things that he is actually seeing are those appearances, and he can see below them to the true nature of the computer code. You can see the picture on the right-hand side, right, is Neo in the moment of realization where he sees the computer code around him, he sees the agents at the end of the hallway, he sees the hallway, and he knows the true nature of what is below the appearance. This is the idea of Zahiriyya and Batiniyya, right? Zahiriyya is this appearance of what we think is going on, and Batiniyya is what is truly going on, the true nature of reality. Now, Ismailis and some other groups that we're going to discuss believe that the world that we see, the Qur'an that we have, the fiqh, the Sufis, the Shiite, the Sufis, the Sunnis, the Shiites, all of this is apparential. We're not really touching what God truly wants us to understand about the nature of reality. And there are secret codes and symbols and understandings that are beyond this apparential world and are in the batin, are in this hidden world. And you can see sort of a diagram of Ismaili Batiniyya, where in the center you have the universe as we understand it, right? The Zahiriyya. Then you have the universal soul, right? That there's a transcendent intelligent creator that sort of connects what is appearance to what is divine. Then we have the universal intellect, which is God's mind. And then we have the unconditioned reality, which is God beyond any kind of limitation. And the goal of somebody who believes in the Batiniyya is to pierce these levels and to understand what Neo understood in that moment, right? What the true nature of the Batiniyya was.
Richard, this cosmo view is very interesting. Is that possible they get Islam get the idea from Plato or Neoplatonic like Plotinus? Look like they are the same and or very similar. So are they getting the idea from Plato?
They may well have done. I don't know because it has a very sort of Greek feel to it. But I don't know the actual link. I couldn't tell you. So
they look very similar. So
yeah. As Nurul points out in the comments, many others also dealt with Zahiri and Batini. It wasn't just Ismailis. Sufis also tend to engage in this doctrine. Now, one of the things that I want to address, because it's all over the internet, is the idea of Taqiyya. Now, one of the things that started developing is as Shiite groups started believing in this distinction between Zahiri and Batiniya, other groups became resentful or bothered by these understandings. So Shiite Muslims would lie to other Muslims about the nature of their Islamic belief, right? That they didn't believe in this Zahiriya Batiniya distinction, that they weren't engaged in this sort of deeper understanding of God because they knew it could lead to persecution. And this became called Taqiyya, this idea of dissimulation to avoid persecution. But this is used almost exclusively by these Shiite mystical traditions. Unfortunately, this idea of dissimulation has become very popularized on the internet as Muslims can lie to protect their faith, which is generally not the belief of most Muslims, and most Sunnis are completely unaware of this doctrine anyway. You can see on the right-hand side, Bashar al-Assad. He's a member of the Alawite religious group, which is a 12er Shiite group that observes this sort of Zahiriya, Batiniya distinction. And Alawites have spent a significant amount of time practicing Taqiyya to hide their beliefs because other Muslims around them, especially Sunni Muslims, might harm them if they believe that they are not Muslim, if they believe that they're violating these principles of Tawhid or Shirk or any of the other ones. So one of the things that really separates Sunnis and Shiites is how they've organized power structures and how they have advanced through history. So the Sunnis advanced through the Khalifa line of succession. So there was usually a caliph who was in power. That person was presiding over an empire. That empire almost always contained the cities of Mecca and Medina. And whoever that emperor was, whoever that caliph was, that person was the next Sunni caliph in succession. So you have Muhammad, and he's followed by the Rashidun caliphs. the four of them. Then they're followed by the Umayyad caliphs. Then the Abbasids take over, and they're followed by the Abbasid caliphs for nearly 100 years. And then for 400 years, the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. And the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Abdul Majid II, resigned the title of caliph without a successor. And so there has been no caliph in the Sunni world since 1924. But there's a pretty direct line of succession, and we're going to be following this line of succession because almost always whoever is ruling the caliphate is in control of the largest Islamic empire in the world. The Shiites, it's a little trickier. So the Shiites are following a direct linear line from Ali. Ali being the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad, right? So Muhammad then falls to Ali. Then you see that it goes through this line of imams. At the fifth imam, you have a split between the Zaydis and everybody else. And then after the sixth imam, you have a split between the Twelvers and the Ismailis. And then once you move through the Fatimid caliphs, you have a dynastic split at the end between the Nizaris and the Musta'anis, who are both Ismailis, the Nizari Ismailis being the assassins. And the Nizari Ismaili imams still exist today. Aga Khan IV, for example, is the current Nizari Ismaili imam. The Twelver imam, as I said, has gone into hiding. It's Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Mahdi. That person has gone into hiding. The Zaydi imams don't exist. And the Musta'ali imams, some of them do exist. So these imams continue to today. And as we mentioned before, the Shiites believe that these imams have a direct connection to heaven. It's very similar to the Mormon idea that their leaders are continually receiving revelation from God. So these imams have this connection to God. The caliphs do not have a connection to God in the Sunni perspective, right? In the Sunni perspective, the caliph is just a terrestrial ruler. He has a religious obligation to protect Mecca and Medina, but the actual religious governance will be taken care of by that religious leader, right? We talked about the division between secular authority and religious authority. The Shiites believe that this religious authority is vested in the imam, and the secular authority, to the extent that they are not the imam, needs to take guidance and authority from the imam, or barring that, a spiritual leader who can have some kind of contact with the imam.
So, excuse me, like Shia, the leader, like Khomeini, right? Is he an imam or he's not?
He's not. He is what's called an Ayatollah, right? He's a spiritual leader, because under 12er Shiite Islam, which is what Iran is ruled by, their final imam, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Mahdi, is in hiding. So the Ayatollahs have taken the role as spiritual leaders to guide the regime.
So do we know who is the imam, or we don't know at all? That the 12er, 7er, 5er, right? So are they all exist, or do we know that's the guy?
The 12ers don't know where the guy is. But
the 12 people, you don't know.
We don't know. But the Nizari Ismailis, for example, believe they know. And they have, and Aga Khan IV is a living person. He has, a palace in Switzerland, and he visits Muslim countries from time to time. And he's the 49th Imam of the Nizari Ismailis.
Some sect know, some sect you don't know.
Correct.
So when I say you don't know, it's just you, Richard doesn't know, or
no.
Nobody know.
The Shiites in the 12er school, which is the one that runs Iran, they say that the person who is the imam is Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Mahdi. However, the point is that they don't know where he is.
They means nobody knows.
Nobody knows. He's in hiding. Well, the only people who know are very, very spiritual people.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So they exist, 12 people, but you don't know who they are.
Right.
Okay. You may run into the street, but you don't know. That's it.
It's a lot like in Judaism, you have that Messiah named, I forget his name, and you open the door for him to come in at Passover. And of course, he never comes, right? What's his name again? Elijah? Elijah.
But, Elijah himself is not the Messiah in Judaism. Elijah is the person who will bring tidings of the Messiah.
Oh. But I'm saying, you know, he's a guy who you believe exists, but he never comes in. Never.
Well, right? No, he will come when the time is right.
Oh.
They're actually,
but these people live forever or they will die, and then these 12 people, they will die, right?
No, he is the 12th person. He's in the thing. He's the 12th person. He won't die until it's his time to die.
Oh, so he lived for long. So 12 means 12th person or number 12?
Yes, he's number 12 in the line of succession.
Oh, number 12. So do we say 7 or 12 or 5, right? Are they talk about 5 people or talk about 5 people?
Right, exactly. The Zaydis or fivers, right? Ali, Hassan, Hussein, Ali, Zayd. 5.
Oh, okay. So it's number 5 and number 12, right?
Yeah.
Okay, got you. Okay, so I totally misunderstood.
No worries. Now, one of the things that is interesting in terms of development is that Islam, of course, like any other element in reality, undergoes historical developments and modifications. And some of those modifications result in what I'm calling post-Islamic religions. These are religions that started where Islam was and then moved out of Islam. And there are several reasons why that could happen. Some say that there was prophecy after Muhammad died. Some of them have strong veneration for Ali, right? That first Imam. And so that veneration of Ali comes very close, or does in the eyes of many Muslims, violate Tawhid. Some of them are syncretic with other religions in the area. Like, for example, the Alawites celebrate Christmas and drink wine, engage in this batiniya, right? They believe that there's this underworld and secret knowledge that exists. And you can see almost all the post-Islamic religions at least have 2 of these different factors, sort of put them in the category of being post-Islamic religions. And you can see, in many ways, they look like Muslims. There might be some difference in their dress or in their buildings or otherwise, but you can see from the Baha'i gardens in Haifa, Israel, to Alevis who are celebrating in a Jemevi, and you can see in the center of the Alevi celebration is a dervish who's doing something, who's very clearly behaving in the same way that he would if he were a Mevlevi Sufi in the Sunni orders, right? You have in the upper right-hand side, Alawites who are gathering to pray. And in the lower right, you have the Yarsani, who are noticeable because of their mustaches. I wanted to do sort of a deeper dive on the Druze, so you can sort of see how a post-Islamic religion can work. So the Druze started as Ismaili Shiites. And they believed that the 6th Fatimid Caliph, Hakim, who you can see on the left-hand side, they believed that he went into this secret magical hiding, that only the true people knew where he was hiding, right? This is a Batiniya issue, right? In truth, he went into hiding. The people think he died in the wilderness, but in truth, he went into hiding and he discovered what are called the Rasail al-Hikmah, the Epistles of Wisdom, which is a new holy book. And that holy book has secret knowledge about how to understand the Qur'an and how to understand the world. So in order to understand this knowledge, the society was split into who are called the Uqad, the people who have wisdom, and the Juhad, the people who are ignorant. And in order to become Uqad, these wisdom-holding people, you need to be at least 40 years old, you have to be a man, you have to show religious devotion through your entire life, and only then can you be exposed to the secret knowledge, the batin, that the rest of the world cannot know from this Rasail al-Hikmah. You can see in the upper right-hand side a number of these Uqad. They're distinguishable by wearing the turbans and waving the Druze flag. And those are the leaders of the Druze community, these Uqad. The majority of people who are Druze are Juhad, so they don't even know the nature of their holy text, right? Because all of this is hidden from them, because then they could contaminate it by spreading it to others. right? Only somebody who has shown that they are devoted to this secret is somebody who's allowed to be told the secret. There are some things, though, that we know about Druze religion. For example, they don't meet in a mosque. They meet in a place called a maqam, which literally means place. And they have prayer groups that meet on Thursdays instead of on Fridays, which is the typical Muslim day of long-standing prayer. And the only people who go to prayer are these uqad. The juhal do not go to prayer, right? As opposed to Islam, where everybody has an obligation to pray. So you can see we have several different violations going on here, right? We've got Tawhid issues, right? Because this Fatimid Caliph has sort of ascended to some other plane of existence. There's sort of a question about that. There's something syncretic about Druze tradition, in that they're taking on sort of attributes of other religions in their area. You can see that they've got their own new holy book, which means that Muhammad is not the final revelation. So we have these sort of elements that sort of put it outside the sphere of Islam, and lead it to be a post-Islamic religion. And that's all she wrote, folks. Any last questions, or should we just close out for the night?
That's terrific, Richard. That's very good, very dense. I'm not sure I could pass the detailed quiz, but that's very impressive, and I guess we'll be going over it. So yeah, that's wonderful.
I think you should.
Thank you, Richard.
Please, so we will understand. We'll have a better, memory.
You know what? Actually, Ralph had a good point. There's a history trivia thing. It doesn't necessarily, we don't need to get it right 100%, but I think for going forward, Richard, I'm going to be down for that. If you can just have like a couple of questions and answer.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea, because then it will be kind of like play format. Like what is the branches of Sufism, and like people could just answer, number 4, and you can have like something funny like that on, question D would be like, Hashashins, I don't know, something like that,
Yeah, exactly. Were you listening last night?
Because I think when people are interactive like that, it's awesome. But this is really great, man. Mm-hmm. And like I said, Richard is presenting next Tuesday again. You can safely bypass my presentation.
Yeah, so next Tuesday, we're going to cover what led up to because we're going to see what the Middle East looked like before Islam, right? The Persian Empire, at that time called the Sassanid Empire, and the late Roman Empire. What were the politics going on? What were the issues in those states? And we'll sort of go through that. As I said, and I think Ralph sort of highlights this, that's the great thing about this being recorded, right? As we go through the timeline and these sort of terms get brought up, you can always go back and say, oh yeah, that's the thing that he's referring to when he says that the Ismailis are separating from the Zaydis, or this is what he's referring to when he says the biography of the prophet, this and that. So,
Richard, were you a religion major?
No. and I'm sure Nora will tell me everywhere where I got wrong. So
Richard can recite a Hammurabi law and the old tenets of the Torah in a matter of 2 seconds. Eye for an eye.
Yeah.
So one question: Does a Muslim require circumcise?
Yes. Islamic tradition requires male circumcision. Female genital circumcision is obviously a contested topic. To a certain degree, it is cultural. Most groups of fiqh say that it is recommendable or neutral to have it. So there is a religious push on it as well. So it's not divorced from religion, but there's definitely more of a cultural element. And because it's not in the Qur'an and it's not in any of the early fiqh, it's in later fiqh. Sorry, early jurisprudence is in later jurisprudence. It's much easier to convince Muslim leaders in many countries, even very traditional ones, to fight against FGM. But male circumcision is uniformly supported.
Yeah, in fact, I think as a joke, they used to say when Jews the last thing would go before the conversion for Jews were the circumcision.
Yeah.
So they will give up everything else, wine, kosher, but circumcision was the last thing to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the funny thing. But Richard, listen, this was really incredible, and I'm looking forward to next Tuesday. Just to give you an update, if you guys want to go to the schedule, or I can just quickly swing through the things that we have to present. This week, this Thursday, we're going to talk about Jewish Hazaria, or Volga, Bulgaria, which was a Muslim state in Russia, and the Jewish Hazaria was one of the only state that converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages. And so we'll talk about that. And then Richard has another presentation on Byzantine Sassanid politics on Tuesday. And then we're going to go back to Roman, and then we're going to talk about Roman Republic, and we're going to talk Constitution of Roman Republic next Saturday. And then if you guys want to join us in New York on 25th, we're doing the Uzbekistani food, getting together, obviously not over Zoom. We're getting together, it's in Regal Park, and it's a restaurant called Shashlishna. It's on the 25th at 1 o'clock. All right. Otherwise, I do see you guys, and thank you, Rich, again.
All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
I hope you enjoyed it.
I enjoy it a lot. Thank you.
All right, bye.